the first little chunk of this is a lot of sort of setting the foundation. And what is this? Who am I? Why are we here? This is a training session, and I will sort of preface to say that there is a lot packed into here. So this is very much an invitation for y'all to really kind of absorb, consider, explore all of these different concepts and sentiments that I'm gonna guide us through today. After this session, and definitely continue these conversations that should not end in this space. So all that being said, this is ideally reimagining youth peer support, a healing-centered harm reduction approach to specifically experiences of self-harm and crisis. And I'll introduce myself more formally in a moment, but I am Shayn McDonald, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs. So I am currently a youth program coordinator at a national nonprofit called Youth Move National, which, trying to put it briefly, we are a youth-led, youth-driven social justice organization seeking to uplift the voices, perspectives, and leadership of young people across youth serving systems that they have experience with, right? All of us are folks who ourselves have navigated systems and different lived and living experiences. As with all of this lived experience driven work, it's absolutely professional and personal. I will also share that I am geographically and at least under settler colonialism in Massachusetts. So not too far from y'all, although my certification and peer support infrastructure might be a little bit different than y'all. So just to kind of name my creds, if you will, I am formally certified in my state as a certified peer specialist. So that's sort of that overarching credential that isn't specific to an age range, but is kind of more geared towards adults, right? And then I was very invested in supporting young people because for me, my lived experience in navigating systems really has been as a young adult, and I am turning 30 next month, but I would still consider myself at least near peer to young adults in that sense too, and still feeling like I'm navigating that transition in my own way. And specific to this topic too, I figured I'd acknowledge that I am a person of many lived and living experiences and identities, and that includes some terms that I self-identify with, including experiences of madness, being queer, trans, neurodivergent. I'm also someone that uses the term autism to describe my experiences and have a formal diagnosis. And I also identify as a trauma survivor. I do have my share of psychiatric diagnoses and labels, which I will not share today because the focus really, I'm hoping, is to kind of shift away from and expand upon those words, labels, and ideas, right? But definitely bringing my lived experience specifically around navigating mental health and crisis services as a young person, as an attempt survivor, as someone who has had previous experiences navigating relationships with self-harm, substance use, and someone who I'll talk about in a little bit has a pretty complex ongoing relationship with death and dying that is actually really affirming and empowering to me in living my life, which is something that isn't recognized too much around conversations uh, around these experiences. So that's just a lot of a little bit about me. But I want to talk a little bit more about this session and kind of bring us all together. Noting that this is a very hot topic, if you will, like across different spheres and conversations, and acknowledging that there are, I imagine, a wealth and diversity of living experiences, roles, perspectives, right? Within this group, I would love for us to kind of start by taking a brief kind of collective grounding moment. So I always want to honor accessibility and self-determination as feels good and true to folks in this space. So as you're able and feel comfortable to, please do feel free to do any kind of practice to try to ground yourself and sort of center yourself in this space and conversation. So that could be taking a deep breath or two, right? Um, tightening and loosening your muscles, right? Kind of readjusting your body position in this space, right? Um, Anything that you need to do to feel fully present in this space feels comfortable and doable for you. And for folks who may have joined after I shared this, I would love to be able to see folks on camera, but again, totally honor your comfortability in this space, especially when it comes to this topic, and the closeness that you might have to that. Uh, I also want to acknowledge, as folks are doing that grounding, right, that this discussion is, again, uniquely sensitive, really complex, and that's especially true when it comes to supporting youth who are below the age of consenting to services, right? And all things mandated reporting, which I promise we will absolutely discuss in a bit. And in addition, definitely want to give a bit of a content note, right? We will absolutely be referencing, discussing trauma and other potentially activating content. And I absolutely encourage you to honor your right to self-care as feels good and true to you. If that means being off camera, taking breaks off camera, participating in the chat, right? Taking space away and returning back if you need to. Totally welcome here. Ooh, and I do want to acknowledge this piece, right? Connecting with and channeling that energy of curiosity, connection, compassion. And then this really important piece, right? Openness to learning and unlearning, which can be really uncomfortable. And I know from firsthand experience, right? But it's important as we hold the space together and really seek to try to shift paradigms away from what we maybe have come to understand is the sort of be all and end all around these experiences, which I'm hoping after this session you'll find is not necessarily the case. And I know that folks are just joining us. We're just doing some kind of intro, prefacing, grounding. And with that, I don't want to take up too much time in us all kind of collaborating around creating a collective agreement for learning and sharing this space together just because we only have so much time. So I am offering this this pre kind of developed list of agreements for us. Hoping that folks can take a moment to review these. I'll kind of highlight them. And then if folks would be willing to share once I do go through them, and I'll note this, any kind of response noting agreement to these principles. And then, of course, if you have anything to add, change, or emphasize from this list, definitely welcome folks to use the raise hand feature if you'd like to unmute and share or drop things in the chat. And I will give creds to the person who created this initial list. This is from Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness curriculum. I imagine that folks who have been in this workforce for a while be familiar with Brene Brown, and definitely more of kind of a critical lens being taken on her work, just around her being a cisgender, heterosexual white woman, speaking to a lot of things that folks of different experiences that have been historically and presently marginalized have been speaking to for a long time. So got to preface there. But this list is pretty solid and has been helpful across spaces I've been in. So I am hoping that folks will be able to share their truths in this space, right? Speak from your own experiences, lived and learned, right? Try not to overtake the narratives of other folks, right? Really seek to understand, right? Always consider that greater why and intention behind why a person might be holding your perspective or have a particular like standpoint, right? We definitely want to respect others' experiences, right? We may have different or similar stories to share and context to draw from, and all are legitimate and valid because we are humans having those experiences and perspectives, right? It doesn't mean that they're not causing harm or that there isn't something to coming together and exploring those things further, right? And we can do that without necessarily moving into like direct intensive conflict, right? So the idea is to approach points of disconnection or unexpected ideas that might be kind of challenging or clashing with ones that you hold with curiosity, right? Not immediate judgment. That idea of challenging ideas, not people. That being said, if there is any like overt discrimination, harm done, right? That's a little bit different. Like, please do like acknowledge that in the chat or let myself or Casey in this space. No, Casey Carpenter, I see you nodding. And then we'll definitely address that. But I imagine that will be good in this space. I'm not doing a great job of this, but I promise there'll be opportunities for y'all to join this conversation. But that idea of taking and making space, right? If you're feeling a little shy, as much as you can, even if it's in the chat, sharing your perspectives, your thoughts. And if you find that you're taking up a decent amount of our discussion time, maybe like pulling back a little bit just for other folks to chime in. And then honoring confidentiality. So that idea of what's shared here stays here, what's learned here leaves here, right? Not sharing any like specific identifiers or personal details that might allow someone in your story or a perspective being shared that's not you to be identified. And I do see Neil in the chat. Bringing self-help back into healthcare is my highest purpose, which creates the ability to help others do the same, I have discovered. Ooh, I love that. And that idea of, self-help, self-determination, right? That reclaiming throughout navigating systems and these different experiences is definitely like my mission. And I love that you shared that. Thank you so much. And please do like feel free to share other sentiments as they like come up for you across my more like didactic kind of talking at you pieces. And otherwise, unless anyone has anything to add or change to this list, could I get, especially considering folks are off camera, either like a reaction with a heart, a thumbs up. You could put an agreed in the chat. I'll give a thumbs up if this all feels good to me, and I can definitely do my best to honor these things, right? Awesome. I love it. Thank y'all so much. All right. So I did talk about participation, right? I definitely want to engage y'all in this session. So one way we're going to be doing that is by using Menti polls. So for folks who haven't used these before, fairly user-friendly, I'm hoping. That being said, if they are unfriendly to folks can absolutely feel free to drop responses to things in the Zoom chat or even direct message me. Just noting that Menti allows responses to be completely anonymous, both to me on the kind of back end and for other folks in this space too. So if you are sharing anything in response to these polls in the Zoom chat, just be mindful around what you feel comfortable sharing, as other folks will see it. And thank you, Casey. There is one poll that I'll get into shortly. That's just sort of an ask for your affinity to this space and your closeness professionally or personally to this topic that we're focusing on today. I believe that I have it open and answerable. So if you click on that link that's in the chat, if you want to kind of explore and dabble with trying out Menti and seeing about this polling as we're getting into it, you can feel free to answer that first poll. And then it's the same link for all of these polls, and the next kind of poll to answer will come up once I shift to the next question. But right now you only have that first one. And again, if Menti doesn't work for you, totally okay. You can feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. And I'd love for anyone across these polls to use the little raised hand feature on Zoom if you'd like to speak into this space. All right. Doing a lot of prefacing here, but we're almost done. Okay, so learning objectives, right? I think these are already kind of described maybe in the description of the session, right? But it's really unpacking and redefining all of the sort of core foundational narratives and approaches around youth experiences of self-harm and crisis, right? Or what we consider to be mental health crisis within those youth serving systems, right? And ultimately shifting the approach in youth peer support and honing in on this trauma-conscious, healing-centered harm reduction framework, which we'll kind of build up, right? The idea is to recenter those core elements of peer support, right? Regardless of age, agency, autonomy, and self-determination for folks navigating these experiences, and particularly for youth today. And with all of this, and sort of reflecting on critiquing systems and greater narratives, really kind of turning in to ourselves and doing that self-reflection around maybe some of our personal biases. And I'll explain what this is for folks who might be unfamiliar: carceral logic in our understanding and approaching of these experiences, even as peers and peer supports, right? So that's the intention, and that does bring us to our first poll. So let me bring it up on my screen. And I will say I'm hoping that this shows up on your devices a little bit clearer in terms of the answers, because on my screen the answers are a little gray. Okay, awesome. So folks, I think can see my poll, or it's up on the screen. Thank you, Heather, for the information. I appreciate it. Good to know. Um, so yeah, again, this first poll is just kind of gauging affinity in this space, in lieu of full round robin introductions. So which of the following apply to you in terms of your personal professional closeness to this session? So I think we have almost everybody answered, if not everybody. So I see most folks have firsthand lived or living experiences. Thank you so much for joining. I honor and appreciate you, regardless of the roles that you take in support of youth. Definitely understand and understand too that folks may have chosen multiple options, right? I resonate across a few of these, right? And I appreciate that we have folks with both firsthand experience, that vicarious experience. And I was given a little bit of insight that specifically like the youth peer support workforce is still getting its grounding a bit in your state. And so there may not be a whole lot of opportunities for folks to get into these roles more formally. I could be wrong, but that was my understanding. So just in reference to those zeros for actively supporting youth and young adults in these roles. Yeah, Neil, I'm speaking specifically to New York. I'm trying to stay in New York specifically today. And Casey, if you want to speak to that, absolutely. But as far as I'm aware, it's sort of like your overarching credential, and then like folks might kind of do this type of work, but it doesn't exist formally as a specific specialized role.
Yeah, so there is a youth peer advocate credential. It's one of the smaller groups of employees as far as the whole peer support workforce in New York goes, but it has been around a while. It's just a smaller portion of the workforce.
That makes sense. And it's definitely not unique to y'all. There are other states that don't even have this workforce developed yet and are working to make it happen. So, ooh, thank you, Heather. I'm going to peek at that later. Put a little star on it. Thank you. Awesome. And I knew that there was going to be an other option too. So I have a different affinity to this space. And if you'd like to either DM me or share that in the chat, feel free. I don't want you to feel like you have to spotlight yourself either. If you are joining us and interested in supporting youth in sort of reframing some of these approaches to supporting youth with these specific experiences, you're absolutely welcome here. Awesome. So again, same Menti link. If you want to just not close out your tab, if you have already, no worries, we'll drop the link again. But it's going to kind of stay on this poll until I shift to our next question. But we'll do that in a bit. So let me get back to my slides. I think they're back in front of folks. Awesome. All right. Oh, never mind. We're right on to another poll. My goodness. Okay, so I do have one more little poll, and then I'm going to be talking at you for a little bit around unpacking some of these traditional narratives. So let me get back to my poll. Sorry, y'all. My biggest thing is text switching. Okay, so the second question is, before I offer a whole bunch of information that might kind of shape and form understandings around what this could mean, I'd love for y'all to consider the statement, "I am safe," as a self-affirmation, and as best you can, all circumstances considered, right, as an ideal living reality, right? So the idea is to try to release any formal or externally defined ideas on what safety means, right, or could mean for you individually as a person, right? So again, consider the concept of safety not from a formal or externally defined definition or viewpoint, right, but from your personal perspective for this reflection prompt, right? So when you think about what safety means to you, for you, what words or phrases come to mind? There's no specific wrong answer. But again, the idea is, in your words, when you think about absent of what anyone else might say or define safety to mean, what kind of words and sentiments come to mind? Be drawn to safer. I appreciate that too. Safer spaces, not safe spaces. Accountability, commitment to learning, mutual respect, and feedback helps. I love that so much. I imagine folks might be kind of typing out their responses. I see from Chaplin, yes, this is how I live my life. I love that. And I appreciate, and I can note as folks are adding to this as well, that idea of safer, right? And not sort of implying that safety is ever a static thing or a completed effort, right? Something that I always say is that safety is never a promise or a guarantee, but an active, ongoing intention with no finish line, right? Not in a way that's, not that we don't want that, and that again, in an ideal reality, that wouldn't be the case for every in any person, right? But given the circumstances that, as far as I understand, right? And it seems to be the case. There's never going to be a reality or circumstance that is universally safe, right? For every person, every body across lived and living experiences and identities. So that idea of safer and intention of safety, I think, is awesome. Um, I see reliable access to shelter, food, warmth, water, clean air, belonging. It took me to think of those, right? Those social determinants of health, right? Those things beyond our natural biology that might inform how we experience our minds and bodies. I love that. Peaceful. Relationships is foundation, solidarity, knowing your neighbors, community, bodily autonomy. I resonate with that one too, and definitely relevant to this topic. Ooh, I see in the chat. Safety means being in a personal state of inner power and self-respect creates outer safety. Ooh, I love that idea of inner power. Peace is my power. I love that. Reality is what you make it, and stability of mind. I love that as that is defined and interpreted by you for you. Um, and I always get a little antsy around the idea of like stability too, specifically when it comes to this conversation and overarching narratives that folks don't necessarily hold themselves, but absolutely honor the words that folks choose to name and reflect towards their own experiences. And for me, like stability, equilibrium, I think is something that I'm always kind of moving towards, and for me feels in line with safety for myself. So folks can continue adding to this poll. Now there's going to be a little break before the next one. But thank y'all so much for sharing. Uh, these are amazing. All right. So, as promised, getting into the didactic, right? We're going to start by unpacking some of these more traditional narratives before we start to explore some newer, more transformative ones and kind of build a greater overarching framework together. So, something that I've been doing across these spaces, more so with folks who are not specifically within these peer roles. So, I'm hoping that this is more like of a solidarity in community kind of myth busting with y'all, and not more of a learning experience for y'all, but definitely important to note, right, across these efforts to implement these youth peer support workforces and roles, and to ensure, right, integrity, fidelity, honoring our roles, our ethics, our values, our purpose, right? Really getting at some of these more troublesome narratives and harmful narratives that are kind of emerging across these journeys, right? So starting with this kind of fragile peers, and that's really what I have on the slide here, right? But in peer support, right, we often encounter and continue to have to advocate against this idea of being these fragile peers, right? That misconception that those with lived experience working in these roles are inherently vulnerable, delicate, or unable to handle stress and responsibility compared to folks in other roles, right? And there's this idea that folks in these roles are more vulnerable to burnout and even re-traumatization than other folks in other roles, right? And another layer gets kind of added to that in a similar sense when it comes to youth peer support, because youth and young adults are similarly considered more fragile and vulnerable than adults, right? So by being youth and by being people with lived experience, both of those things tend to be considered as vulnerable points or even weaknesses when it comes to being in these roles. However, and I imagine we all know this, right? The fact is we take on these roles, ideally, as long as they're communicated transparently to us, right? With the understanding that we will be sharing and returning to memories of traumatic experiences. We'll be working directly in systems in which we may have experienced harm, and with others who may share similar traumas or difficult life experiences, right? So in that, absolutely, it's important that we honor our own expertise and ability to do this work, that we advocate for others to acknowledge that, while of course giving thoughtful consideration and intention to boundary setting and self-care, right? We do this work with tact, and I think that that's something that folks really need to honor and appreciate more, and I imagine will be the case as this workforce becomes more grounded, specifically in your state, right? But again, fragile peers, definitely something that we can continue challenging. In addition to some other just quicker sentiments, right? This workforce does not exist simply to fill gaps in staffing shortages, which is an unfortunate sentiment that I've heard, right? Or like kind of like a bandage to that, to reinforce treatment plans or clinical goals because we're particularly close in the nature in which we're able to connect with folks, right? To patch systemic failings, right? And, promote and uplift systems and practices as those kind of like mascots, right? In that decorative sense. Or to be considered a like non-essential supplement or add-on to traditional services as a like, kind of for fun thing, right? This work is essential, it's imperative, it needs to be voluntary, and it needs to be available everywhere, right? And then finally, right, I think that we all know this, lived experience and professional experience being considered two different things. Lived experience is absolutely professional experience. And as I shared, right, in the ways in which we become credentialed and grounded in these roles and in this work, there is tact to that, right? We do learn to approach this work through our lived experience in a strategic way, right? With intention. So awesome. All right. Experience is a focus, right? Oh my gosh, we're already halfway through. I imagine that folks don't have too many questions on these, but just sort of level setting with, what typically systems and particularly SAMHSA I have and the National Institute of Mental Health, just like formal definitions of these experiences of focus for today, right? So self-harm, self-injury refers to when a person causes physical harm to themselves on purpose, right? And then suicidal ideation, suicidality, risk of suicide, right? Thinking about considering planning suicide, which is the ending of one's own life, right? It can be something that is more kind of passive, something more like kind of active at the forefront of our attention, right? It can be a temporary experience. It can be something that is ongoing and consistent, right? And I will say crisis for the most part, is lacking like a formal definition when it comes to being within mental health systems. There's a lot of focus specifically on defining crisis response, but not really specifically getting at what we even mean by crisis, right? But I did find these from NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and then I also have from the New York State Office of Mental Health website kind of some wording around that, right? But the idea of it being any situation in which a person is considered to be at risk of harm to themselves or others, but also is considered to be unable to care for themselves, function effectively, right, or care for themselves in their communities, right? But really definitely want to note that there isn't one kind of specific concrete definition of crisis universally, right? Definitely still a conversation that's being had, right? And in terms of traditional narratives, right, supporting youth with experiences around self-harm and suicide can be one of the more difficult aspects of this work in general, right? And is one of the most important opportunities for us to take a more unique and progressive approach in youth peer support and peer support at large, right? And even shift the paradigm around how we understand these ideas of response and prevention, right? So traditional intervention approaches for youth experiencing self-harm and crisis have long and often been ineffective and harmful, right? I can speak from my own lived experience that is absolutely true for me. These approaches often prioritize monitoring and assessing for certain perceived behaviors, right? And emphasize keeping a person alive at all cost, which is this idea of compulsory liveness for folks who are unfamiliar, right? Which can often ignore the autonomy and personal choices of those going through these experiences, right? And for those like me who experience suicidality or relationships with death and dying as a significant part of their lives, this approach can be particularly damaging, right? The idea of enforcing abstinence or complete and often, right now, elimination of a behavior or coping practice often perpetuates or continues to further harm and trauma for folks, right? And these ideas are often considered and typically intended to be in service of care and support, but again, unfortunately, often create further harm. Um, so the idea is to shift the focus in youth peer support, right? And I'm going to kind of move on for now just due to time, because I will sort of recap these things, right? But it's really just centering and continuing to ground ourselves in all of the core values and ethics that we hold as peers across all of the other experiences that we support young people through, right? As much as we can, given that it can be a lot more challenging with these experiences, right? And I'm trying to spend too much time here. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the isms and oppression in this conversation as well, right? So conventional, traditional understandings of crisis and these, more risky or dangerous coping practices are shaped by underlying narratives rooted in oppressive ideologies, right? So settler colonialism, and this is beyond like Western settler colonialism, like Christopher Columbus, right? It's this idea of prioritizing individualism over community and collective care, really focusing on the individual being, the person responsible for identifying and sort of navigating their experiences and being sort of at fault for what they're going through, more so, right? We absolutely want to support folks in reclaiming their own power and autonomy and navigating these experiences. However, we don't want to, assume that all of their circumstances are specifically due to their own doing or not doing, right? And it's just this idea of, to put it as simply as I can, my reality must be your reality because my reality is the reality, right? It's this idea of I'm hold a certain viewpoint and idea. I'm gonna push that on you because that's how I understand things to be true, right? Unfortunately, that's a reality across systems and things, but something that we can continue to advocate for change around, right? Especially when it comes to these experiences. Capitalism is always there, right? Across all different things, right? So that's that focus on labor, tying self-worth and ideas of wellness to productivity, right? And those productivity standards, making it seem like people are only as valuable as what they can produce. And then there's also the fact that, like, yes, we're doing this work ideally because we have a personal vested interest in it. And it is what we're doing to support our livelihoods, right? To get a paycheck. So that absolutely has to inform how we approach our work, no matter what it is, right? But definitely plays a role within peer support and these experiences that are more like liability heavy too, right? Then there's ableism, again, similar to settler colonialism, this idea that like everybody has to have the same human experience and be navigating and understanding things in the same way, right? And this idea of measuring worth by standards of productivity and conformity to temporarily abled or, able-bodied norms, right? And then racism and white supremacy. I'm not going to give a definition of that. I am going to give just a brief kind of highlight of some history that I actually recently became aware of. So with relevance to pathologizing distress or kind of viewing emotional distress and crisis through the lens of like mental illness and as medical conditions, right? There used to be a proposed psychiatric diagnosis, and I can try to put it in the chat when I have a moment, and I'll try to pronounce it. But I believe it's drapetomania, Drapetomania, which was years and years ago considered to be a mental illness that supposedly caused enslaved folks to want to or attempt to escape. It was this idea of it must be a medical condition, right? There could be no reason why someone would want to get out of the circumstance that they're in, right? Really harmful and toxic narrative that again permeates it today. And believe it or not, some of the first suicide prevention strategies were developed in response to captive African people dying by suicide on slave ships during the Middle Passage. If folks are familiar with the speculum oris, as it's called, it was a tool designed to force feed folks who chose to refuse to eat, right? One thing that oh, thank you, Casey, for saving me. Um, something that actually is still used today, not specifically around like suicide prevention as much in a spotlit way, but technically serves the same purpose, right? To reduce folks jumping overboard to try to end their lives. Enslavers ensured that rails on deck were high and would use netting around the ships to catch folks, right? So this idea of, right, folks being in really awful oppressive circumstances, and this idea of folks really centering this idea of just being alive under all cops, right? And despite all of the harm that folks are experiencing, right? All things important to think about. And that history is something that definitely is not actively being shared. At least for me, across my experience, it wasn't something that was ever illuminated. So definitely wanted to share that. These ideas might be a little bit newer to folks, if not brand new to folks. But these are some of those buzzwords that are kind of coming up across more, dare I say, like radical peer support and lived experience driven advocacy conversations. So definitely want to give you all these words to continue to explore further. So Shaynism is this idea that there is a definition of normal, typical, sane, right? And so then there are definitions of what that is not, right? So this concept is deeply tied to roots in eugenics, or this idea of like the ideal or best iteration of a person, right? Which is, of course, rooted in all sorts of other oppressive ideologies, right? But the idea here is, you know, within these conversations too, perceiving behaviors, symptoms, right? And automatically assuming what they mean in terms of a person being functional or healthy or well, right? Um, Again, getting back to that definition of what we even mean by crisis, right? And trying to expand ideas around what that means. But being kind of restricted to our current understandings and what's being put out there now definitely is rooted in this idea of sanism, and that there is this one idea of a normal, healthy, well, functional person, right? That everyone else can be compared to. Then there's suicidism, which I think it might be different definitions depending on where you find it. But for folks with lived experience and advocacy around suicide, suicidism has been sort of reclaimed as this concept of essentially like oppression, discrimination against folks who are themselves attempt survivors who have uh, or who have relationships with suicide in some way, right? It's really framing suicidal thoughts and relationships with death and dying solely as pathology, and shaming, excluding, even criminalizing suicide and attempts of suicide. Um, Lastly, there's adultism, right? So especially for young people, this idea of, you know, you'll understand when you're older, you don't get it now, right? You can't possibly be the expert of your own experience until you reach a certain point in your life, right? Age-wise, which really reinforces this idea that young people cannot self-advocate and reclaim their autonomy in moving through systems and these experiences, right? And all of this is really relevant to this last note here, which I think I just referenced earlier, right? But it's this idea of carceral logic or carceral practice, right? When I say carceral, I imagine that folks might immediately think of like the criminal justice or the juvenile justice system, but it's actually a lot broader than that. So it's really a concept that involves approaches rooted in the idea of addressing social issues in general through punishment, control, and surveillance, right? It stems from this core belief that isolation and punishment will solve these problems. And that extends, again, beyond the criminal and juvenile justice systems, and absolutely into the mental health system, right? So that could mean things like forced hospitalizations for some folks. They self-identify with psychiatric incarceration being their experience, right? Restrictive environments outside of that, just any measures that prioritize control over self-determined healing and empowerment, right? So ultimately, all of these practices, unfortunately, do continue to inform narratives and approaches within systems, even though they may be very subtle, right? They also inform our own understandings of who we are and how we approach our lives and experiences, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I am curious if anybody has thoughts on this. Let me move over. If you have any additional differently worded emphasis around anything that I've shared around narratives or approaches that y'all have encountered in your own work or lives in general that have felt limiting or harmful when it comes to self-harm or crisis. And I am noting that there were folks who I shared that they didn't necessarily have direct like personal affinity to this topic or maybe as like a youth or young adult. But if you do have anything, figured I'd leave some space. Also, if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns around all those different words and terms that I just shared with you, pause for a moment on that too.
I have a question.
I hear a voice. I don't know who it's come from. Please do share. Ooh,
Yeah,
Neil?
can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so these kind of, I guess you could call them somewhat labels that you identified. Do they really truly should we really truly put ourselves in these categories and what I consider to be somewhat, boxes that if we identify with them, then, we might start taking on board certain truisms to attributing to them is what my thought process is, because part of being on the spiritual journey is about identifying false belief systems that we've taken on board as our truth that may not actually be the truth about us. Just a thought.
I think that absolutely gets at a core point and purpose that I have in this work absolutely is that while language in different terms and ways of identifying experiences and different aspects of our identities can be really affirming to us, that idea of projecting one's that we might hold or just ideas of in words to describe our experiences onto other people is within itself like carceral logic. It is within itself a kind of this settler colonialist idea, right? My reality must be your reality because my reality is the reality. So I'm not sure specifically, and if you want to illuminate on what you meant by like boxes and specifically what labels you're referring to, I am curious. But absolutely, the idea is really like energetically expanding and not condensing and reducing and overly categorizing folks for sure.
Well, by boxes, I mean bondages. And then we experience those bondages and experience kind of emotional suffering, which is a kind of a spiritual dis-ease of the soul, if you know what I mean.
Mm,
So the idea is to move out of the box and move more in an unlimited state of awareness, where you're not categorizing yourself based on very narrow, identifying terms, is what I'm saying, somewhat.
yeah, and I so appreciate you sharing. I really and I knew Casey that I was going to be running out of time too. I'm like, oh, I might have to come back for part two. I don't know. But all that said, I think that it's a balance between acknowledging envisioning and seeking to move toward and really moving like abstractly and literally towards and with that intention of everyone being honored and appreciated for who they are, regardless of labels, and not needing to even like refer to any specific labels or categorizations or even refer to these isms, right? And acknowledging that in our current reality, there are folks that are having experiences in their lives that are out of their control and due to historical and ongoing powers that be that other folks don't necessarily have to experience, right? It's a whole kind of like privilege and oppression, intersectionality conversation, right? So, and I think there is something to holding multiple truths in this conversation too, right? And I can think about that as someone who both wants to always honor someone's right to bodily autonomy. And when I'm thinking about specific people in my life and the fear of harm happening to them or losing them, then I start to feel this pull towards those mandated moments sometimes too, right? And it can be hard to kind of hold those things within ourselves. But all that being said, definitely encourage y'all to explore further. And thank you so much for sharing because it continues to kind of expand this this idea of framing our perspectives and approaches. So, and I do see vilifying parents, caregivers when they often have experienced their own traumas too. Definitely, I don't have too much of that in this conversation, although it's definitely important, right? The involvement of parents and connecting with, collaborating with, supporting parents around these young people's experiences as well too. And absolutely, folks have their own lived experiences, even if they are sort of considered to be in that supporting role and not that kind of center person receiving support too. Yeah, black and white thinking, right? That idea of it has to be this or that, right? Not holding multiple truths. But mandated reporting too, I definitely want to make sure we get to that. There's no way I'm gonna move through this entire slide deck today. And I'm so sorry. I should have timed myself, but that being said, this conversation is awesome. I appreciate everything that folks have been sharing. And I'm hoping that at least these materials, once they're shared with you, will be enough to continue exploring further beyond what I'm able to get to today. Oh, let me stop sharing and get back to my slides. I will also share with Casey all of the responses to these polls, again, that are totally anonymous, so that y'all receive them too if folks do end up continuing to add things. So awesome. All right. I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce at least the framework that I'm hoping to get at today, and I'm so sorry, y'all. These are frameworks, models, concepts, ways of kind of approaching this work that I imagine that folks might be a little bit more familiar with. And the idea from me today was to really like weave these all together into one overarching framework, right? So that idea of trauma informed or even trauma conscious care, right? Folks are kind of moving a little bit away from trauma informed care as a framework because there's a little bit, maybe too much focus and energy around trauma and reducing trauma, and a little bit less on the sort of healing and growth and kind of forward possibility that healing centered engagement was introduced to sort of expand upon a little bit more. So both trauma-informed and conscious care and healing-centered engagement as two existing models, along with harm reduction, which folks might be more specifically familiar with as an approach to experiences or relationships with substances and substance use, right? Like settler colonialism and a lot of these ideologies that might be specifically sort of associated with pieces of history or specific societal context. Harm reduction is really in service of reducing harm as much as possible around various ways of being and coping that could create danger for a person, right? So that could be substance use, but also self-harm and other experiences like that, right? But the idea is hopefully to weave in all of these three kind of core frameworks into one overarching framework, which is this trauma conscious, healing centered harm reduction framework in service of really uplifting that agency, autonomy, and self-determination of youth and facilitating their ongoing journeys of, and this is an expansion of recovery, right? Folks might self-identify with that language. Some folks might kind of use different language, right? But you know, beyond just recovery, right? Uncovering, discovering, and ultimately reclaiming their own stories, their identities, their essence, their authentic selves, right? That's that kind of idea of liberation from my point of view in terms of what we can support in these roles, right? So, why is this important, right? Authentic youth empowerment. I could go on a whole spiel around how youth empowerment as a kind of buzz term is being promoted and used across opportunities and things in ways that maybe don't feel as truly empowering for youth taking those opportunities and entering those spaces, right? But truly, this is in service of authentic, genuine, affirming youth empowerment and reclamation of that agency, autonomy, and self-determination through navigating these experiences. Unsure if folks are really grounded in the grassroots movement behind why this workforce exists, but without going into it too deeply, peer support has always been about going back into systems with which folks that experience have had maybe harm or experienced trauma within, and supporting folks with being liberated from those systems and reconnecting back to their communities of support, and not having that dependence or like ongoing intensive reliance on systems to move through their lives and experiences, right? So absolutely in alignment with that, as well as our peer support core values, right? Just sort of those general consistent values and ethics across this workforce, no matter where it lies for the most part, right? Expanding access to holistic supports and services programs, right, beyond just clinical treatment or intervention, and transforming systems, communities, and society at large, right? Not just supporting individual people through their individual journeys, right? But it's definitely something that is across the board transformative or aims to be, right? So with 7 minutes to spare, I'm trying to think of the best use of time. I definitely want to acknowledge mandated reporting. I definitely want to at least acknowledge the kind of breakout activity I have for maybe folks to add to some self-reflection practice. And I can also share sort of my feedback on that breakout activity as well, Casey. But I'm also willing to come back too. So all that being said, I believe. Okay, so this poll is up if folks do want to answer it, but I imagine that one of the most common things that's going to come up is what I have in a couple slides, right? So understanding that there are a lot of barriers and challenges in advocating for change and supporting folks in these experiences in a way beyond convention and tradition, right? So it's definitely a paradigm shift that involves acknowledging a lot of different truths that I've definitely already referenced already. And they're there for folks to acknowledge as well. But I do want to acknowledge mandated reporting, right? This was a big learning experience for me in Massachusetts when I took a human rights officer training as a certified peer specialist at a local organization that I worked at. It was really awesome, and I would definitely encourage this to be a thing across the board. But every certified peer specialist on that team was also made a human rights officer, and so we took that training. And it was made clear to me that there is a distinction between mandated reporting and organizational requirements when it comes to reporting these liability heavy, right, experiences, right? So I did go directly into your state and tried to find the most formal definitions and requirements that I could find around how we understand mandated reporting formally, right? So from the New York State Office of Children and Family Services mandated reporter requirements, this is just a little blurb from that, right? But required to report suspected child abuse or maltreatment, right? And even within your kind of statewide overarching code of ethical conduct for being a certified peer specialist or advocate under confidentiality, it acknowledges, confidentiality must be upheld always, right? Except as authorized or required by law, right? There is a point earlier that says that you need to, follow your organizational policies and requirements, right? But when we're talking about mandated reporting, as far as I'm aware, and this has seemed to be the case across spaces and conversations, it's specific to suspected abuse or maltreatment specific to young people and elder adults, which I don't have here because specifically we're talking about young people, right? So that is all to say when it comes to reporting experiences of disclosing self-harm, thoughts of suicide, right? Those typically tend to be within organizational policies and requirements that we can absolutely advocate around and support with trying to shift and change. So I definitely encourage y'all to explore what your sort of organizational agency policies are around reporting self-harm, thoughts of suicide. And this is not necessarily to completely eliminate those things, but to try to inform them to open up space for continuing the conversation once those experiences are disclosed and not immediately having to rush to that mandated reporter action to remove their autonomy or freedom in some way, right? Or enforce some kind of intervention. But yeah, this is really difficult. Again, we have to examine our own personal biases and also self-care through the harm that can be faced by us in trying to honor folks' autonomy, self-determination, and agency through these experiences when we can't sometimes, right? When we do have to have those mandated moments and report. There's only 3 minutes left to spare. I want to honor this greater framework in not keeping y'all past time. And I will send this slide deck out. Unsure, Casey, if you have ideas around kind of next steps or closing out, but
Is that your question, Shane?
yeah, just thinking next. I mean, should I just kind of close out now and open up for questions in this moment? Should we kind of talk about inviting folks for part two? I'm so sorry timing got away from me, y'all.
And I think if folks have the flexibility to stay a few minutes after 2, you could go a little beyond, but also we totally understand if you need to go at 2 o'clock, and also up to you, Shane.
Oh, I'm great. I don't have another call for another couple of hours. So I mean, I'm also totally willing and able to stay on for whoever would like to stick around. Kind of move through the rest of my more didactic content and maybe like give a little pause for those polls. Just to capture in the recording for folks too, if that's helpful. But yeah. Awesome. All right. If folks do have questions, I'm like, please do throw them in the chat, and I'll also share my email just if folks do have to jump off before I continue. In case anything comes up for y'all, you have any questions, I can absolutely loop back to Casey with anything, or just respond to you directly. But through all of my chaos and difficulty with keeping in time, there was so much for me to talk about and share with y'all today, and I got really excited. And time is definitely my biggest barrier. So I appreciate y'all for joining me. If you do need to sign off in a moment, absolutely feel free to do so. Thank you, Casey, for noting that the slide deck will be uploaded in the course resources on the course page. So please do peruse that and click on all the clickable links within that and continue these conversations further. And again, just thank y'all so much for joining me, for exploring in this conversation. And I look forward to connecting with you in the future as much as I'm able to. All right. So, does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts before they sign off?
What does moral injury mean?
So, moral injury is when you basically are pressured to act in a way that goes against your values and the harm that is experienced from that, right? So, like I said, as someone who absolutely wants to honor everybody's bodily autonomy and like voice and choice and navigating experiences, right? To a certain extent, if I'm working in an organization that has reporting policies and I'm a mandated reporter, right, I have to disregard that and take that power and control away from them under certain circumstances, right? And that creates a lot of creates a lot of harm for me, right? As someone who is going against those core beliefs that I have. So that's that idea of moral injury, right? Is that helpful?
Yeah, most definitely. I guess my question would be, you know, how does one identify what their core beliefs are or their moral compasses? That's the big question.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot, and it's difficult to really separate this conversation between, our values and ethics within our working roles and our values and ethics as people, because these are lived experience driven roles and they're absolutely personal. So I will say that there are a lot of like values lists and things, and I can make a note. I do have it. It's youth friendly, but if it's youth friendly, then I'm hoping that it's palatable for any and everybody, as much as possible, right? But I sort of personal mission statement, self-reflection, kind of template tool activity. And it is a little bit geared towards folks who are practicing these lived experience informed support roles. So might be helpful, but yeah, that is definitely a greater conversation too, around really returning to our own personal values. But yeah. And I can do a little bit more justice to this too as I'm continuing to move through, right? And again, if folks need to sign off, absolutely feel free. And thank you for folks who are sticking around. I'm glad to have you. Um, so again, it's important that as well as sort of critiquing, reassessing, trying to shift the narrative and expand upon these overarching frameworks and systemic narratives and practices, right? It's important to take a moment to consider our own personal biases, our own mental models, our worldviews, right? And again, that potential for moral injury in this effort, right? It's important that we evaluate how our work interacts with like police, if we're thinking carceral, specifically when it comes to law enforcement, as well as other carceral institutions, right? And those like more intensive care pathways is sort of a formal term I've heard around like inpatient units and those more intensive restrictive treatment environments, right? But these practices aren't, again, just ingrained in systems, in programs, but also in our interactions with others and even in the ways that we understand and respond to ourselves, right? So the idea is, I mean, across all elements of our human experience, right, as lifelong learners, is to do this continuous self-examination, this self-reflection, and really seeking to ensure that we continue to move away from practices that take away power, control, autonomy, away from folks, even under the guise or with the intent of safety and care, right? And we must also be aware of, again, those internal conflicts that arise when we're pressured to follow mandated practices that, again, like clash with our values, like enforcing that mandatory reporting when we believe in full bodily autonomy and self-determination. It can be distressing to be placed in situations where liability and these rigid reporting requirements can overshadow these core values of agency, autonomy, and trust that we, right, formally strive to uphold. So understanding these conflicts and their impact is really essential to maintaining integrity and to caring for ourselves in this work, right? And the idea is to really try to create supportive spaces that prioritize true self-determined safety or a greater sense of safety, right, and care, really rooted in empowerment rather than control, right, or compliance. So, I know we have fewer folks in this space. I will make it live though for folks who do want to take it. Um, Actually, is it already? Yeah. So, um, acknowledging challenge. Oh, hold on. Very much. Did I skip a? There we go. Okay. So given that mandated reporting is a thing, given that, this idea of youth being under the age of consent to services creates barriers to honoring autonomy across support of these experiences. If y'all have any kind of words, sentiments, ideas, perspectives around what it might mean to you to continue the conversation is sort of this tagline around these experiences with youth beyond immediate reporting. And, again, dreaming an ideal reality beyond existing reporting limitations, maybe organizationally, right? What could it mean to continue the conversation? And if anyone has had any experience, I know that no one noted actively supporting folks in like a youth peer advocate role, but just in general, like had success around supporting a young person around these experiences in a less traditional sense, and would like to share, definitely welcome. And if folks are feeling a little like lost or this feels a little kind of too abstract for folks, what I offer in this next section should be helpful. So I will get back to it, although I'll leave that poll up. Folks should still be able to answer it as I continue. But right, going from kind of the macro philosophy frameworks and getting more grounded in those, right? And then getting into the more micro of reapproaching youth peer support through this framework, through some more practical, concrete, actionable examples. And ideally some breakout practice, although for the purposes of time and things today, I will just sort of highlight the activity and encourage y'all to use it as continued self-reflection and maybe even connect with each other in some way to continue this conversation and try out that activity. So with all that said, key practices in supporting folks across these experiences, whether they are relationships with self-harm or thoughts of suicide, death, or dying, right? Even substance use, right? Really focusing on validating every young person's subjective, unique experiences in their own words, right? Not trying to project words, narratives, or ideas about what a young person might be going through without them choosing those, right? It's also about, again, exploring those intersecting roots and reasons that could be informing why a circumstance may be the case, right? Applies to those traditional narratives around these experiences, but also applies to these individual experiences specifically, right? Moving beyond just kind of perceiving behaviors and symptoms and those coping practices. But again, those intersecting pieces of context that inform why that person might be going through what they are and practicing what they are, right? Which includes oppression, those isms, right? And other life circumstances, right? Like someone shared around their definition of safety, those like social determinants of health, right? Like housing, access to food, shelter, water, clothing, those kinds of things. It's also important that we open up to holding space for learning more about the purpose served by a person's relationship with an experience or a coping practice, right? Which opens up for the conversation and exploring how, in their own words, again, a certain like coping practice might not serve a young person, right? And potential risks that might be involved with continuing in the ways that they are, right? But not in a, dare to be different, abstinence kind of fueled punitive sense, right? The idea is to really offer options to facilitate access to safer alternatives that feel affirming, good, and true to the young person, without, as much as possible, taking power and control away from them in that journey. And I acknowledge not enforcing abstinence, right, which is that, complete elimination of a behavior, usually with that urgency of right here and right now, right? And trying to shift away from that and focus more on supporting youth and reclaiming their relationships with their ways of being and coping that are in service of their goals and in alignment with their lives and inner truths, right? And exploring like what those inner truths are, what that greater vision for who who they want to be, how they want to be honored, affirmed, and supported through their experiences, all those different pieces, right? So just some do's and don'ts for holding space for these experiences, right? It can be really difficult, and there's a lot of, self-care and self-reflection that we need to do to really even enter those spaces sometimes. Because if we're really coming from that place of fear and liability, often we resort to those mandated moments, right? We go right to that assessment for risk, right? And while that's not totally unimportant, we play a role in expanding the conversation beyond that, right? So in terms of do's, mirroring language, as much as possible. I believe in the PDF that I sent you, human experience language is one way of framing this intentional language and peer support. I do have hyperlinked a little article reviewing what that is and what that means. Neil, thank you. Um, so I'll be able to explore that further. It's also important that we continue to honor our peer model and code of ethics as much as we can, even when reporting requirements and things are maybe clashing with that, right? And always important for folks in these roles to seek guidance from their supervisors too, and that everybody around and within this workforce are in support of this greater effort too, as much as possible, right? It's definitely an advocacy effort. It's important that we always respect confidentiality held between ourselves and young people as much as possible, and where we can't honor confidentiality, really leading with transparency, especially in even just like starting off these relationships and getting acquainted with each other and noting like what mutuality and transparency means and where those lines have to be, right? And again, respecting the lived realities, the self-determined and disclosed like narratives and words around what folks are experiencing beyond the labels and narratives that may have been placed on them, right? We don't, or we shouldn't use clinical or pathologizing medical language, right? That is something that we importantly do not do in comparison to other more traditional roles, right? And in that, right, not falling into role substitution or overlap. If something doesn't feel like it's within your role around this, right, or you're being called to do something more clinical or carceral or punitive, right, in ways that don't align with your values or ethics, those are things that you can try to self-advocate around, right? It's also important that we don't provide context for information about a young person without their consent or even seek it, right? Even if we're honoring confidentiality in our relationships, exploring the why and trying to explore these intersecting roots behind a young person's experience doesn't mean interrogating them for that insight and information, right? Definitely honoring their pacing, their comfortability, right? And building that trust over time can absolutely be a thing, especially if trust has been lost over time, understandably. Heather, you're great. Thank you. We don't impose treatment plans or clinical goals. Again, we don't enforce external narratives, labels, expectations, and really seek to uplift and center those of young people themselves. And I already know this, right? But not assuming that sharing is ever given with us just because we are folks in these peer support roles, right? We just create space and approach things in a way that creates more space for that sharing to feel more comfortable and safe. Awesome. And oh, I don't know why the formatting got weird. But there is a resource to explore this further, just like some like really like specific actual recommendations around those like harm reducing alternatives to self-harm. These are things that have been helpful to me in my own life, right? So depending on kind of what the need or urge like is that a young person is seeking to fill or maybe is filling through a self-harm practice of some kind, right? They may be looking for like a distraction, passing time, just kind of moving through the wave, right? So changing environment can absolutely be helpful. I know for me, like I tend to kind of isolate indoors a lot of the time, and even just getting outside and like literally touching grass can make a really significant difference for me and kind of connect me to a world bigger than the, really like restricted and traumatic world that I've lived in across my life, right? And experience. So all these different things like hobbies, crafts, anything to kind of move through time, right? And there are other examples in those resources that I have shared in the deck, right? But also, and I mentioned that kind of personal mission and vision, self-reflection activity, but really kind of returning to your greater why, supporting a young person and really honing in on what is most important to them, right? What their values are, what safety means and looks like for them, right? And that can happen through conversation. That can happen through this self-reflection and journaling, and just kind of, fully expressing our emotions, letting ourselves have a good cry. Even like I'll throw on a movie or a show or listen to a song that I know will kind of bring that up for me when I really need to express it, right? Things like that. Folks may be familiar with those sort of like less dangerous self-harm alternatives that sort of mirror the coping practice or sensation in some way, like holding ice cubes, which can kind of create like a burning sensation in your hand to behold them, but they melt and don't, create greater harm. Snapping like a rubber band, clenching, clapping hands until your hands sting a little bit, right? Even like playing with the senses around taste, like eating particularly spicy or sour foods. Um, in terms of the practice of like self-harm, if it's an experience specifically around like cutting, right? Writing, drawing, painting on skin where someone would practice those things, right? I know when I turned 18, I started getting tattoos, and that's been something that's been really helpful for me, right? And then of course, connecting the communities of resonance and affirmation is something that we can be absolutely supportive with. And I imagine that there are existing support groups, either formally or informally, even with young people, even in your state, around navigating these experiences that are maybe less clinical or agency removing as more traditional, like clinical support groups, right? Awesome. And then I have these questions. Again, this is not an interrogation. These are questions to offer. Around really exploring that greater why, around sort of like unpacking and supporting the young person with making meaning of their experience, of sort of reapproaching those coping practices, thoughts, feelings, emotions, right? And then being recontextualizing them and envisioning a self-determined path ahead that someone in a youth peer support role could facilitate, right? So what do you need to feel truly supported, right? What does feeling safe mean to you in the same sense that I asked y'all, right? What feels missing, harmful, or overwhelming for you right now? Oftentimes that's when things start getting illuminated, right? Like, again, like food scarcity, housing insecurity, even like experiences of like bullying, and exclusion by their peers, right? All sorts of different things, right? Beyond just that surface level perceived like or disclosed coping practice, or those thoughts of life maybe not being sustainable for a person anymore, right? Again, what purpose does this coping practice serve for you? Are there ways in which this practice and what are those ways in which this practice might help you to feel more in control or safe, right? I know for me, self-harm was very much a practice of reclaiming control in circumstances where I felt like I didn't have any. And in a lot of ways, that was a benefit to me amongst all of the harm that I experienced as well. So I see you, Casey. Thank you. So lots of links here. I just wanted to share around centering autonomy and self-care and safety planning, right? So maybe shifting away from or expanding upon those more traditional and rigid safety plans that are often kind of like prescribed to folks, right? Really supporting young people with creating these things for themselves in ways that feel good and affirming to them. So I do have some linked different self-reflection guides and self-care plan templates that I believe are all like fairly youth-friendly too, if not specifically made for young people. So definitely consider exploring those further. And then just this breakout activity that you can absolutely choose to do individually or with colleagues, even as folks within this greater N.A.P.S as well, around trying to weave in this framework with some hypothetical scenarios, right? So the idea is to try to consider doing so with two different hypothetical scenarios that might be something encountered by a person in this youth peer support role, and trying to consider what next steps or approaches that you might take in supporting a young person, given the experience mentioned, what challenges you might anticipate, how you might navigate those, and anything else that might come up, right? So first I have, and I won't read it fully, right, but just an experience of a young person under the age of consent who is practicing self-harm and some other sort of context pieces around that. And then the second one is around a young person who's navigating recurring thoughts of suicide, right? There's some parent context within both of these, some like school context in there too, right? And some like kind of greater visions for what these folks are kind of looking for to give you a little bit of guidance. So throughout the presentation, there's a whole bunch of like hyperlinked things. So definitely like roll your mouse over everything in case something is clickable. But otherwise, I do have this kind of catch-all for the sort of key resources and things that I have for y'all to peruse further. And otherwise, again, just thank you so much for joining me. Please do feel free to reach out and connect with me. I have my email here, as well as continue to learn more about the organization that I'm representing today, which is Youth Move National. And you can follow us across social media pages as well. But otherwise, thank y'all so much, and look forward to connecting in the future.